Hi, everyone, and thank you so much for joining us today for our discussion on using open source safely and effectively. This is a LeadDev webinar created in partnership with Shift Left. Our conversation today will last about 45 minutes, after which both myself and the rest of the panel will head over to the LeadDev Slack to answer some of your questions in the technical strategy channel. We might also have some time to answer a couple of questions live during the webinar, so please do submit anything that comes to mind or any questions that come to mind using the Q&A feature in Zoom. And equally, if you see any question there that really resonates, feel free to upvote so that we can make sure that they come at the top of the list and we make sure that we answer what folks are most curious about. Awesome. So we'll get started with a little bit of introductions first so you know who you're seeing speak today. My name is Maria Dalla. I am currently an engineering manager with Shopify. And over the last few years, I've worked in a variety of different roles, from product development to open source teams to operations and platform teams. So it's been quite an interesting journey of looking at technology from many different perspectives. I'll ask each of our illustrious panelists to introduce themselves. So would love to know a couple more things about who you are and what you do. But also very, very curious to know a couple of things from you. The first one is, what is an open source piece of software or community or project that means a lot to you for whatever reason, be it because it is the first one that you ever worked with, or because it ended up being a pivotal point in your career, or for any other reason. And secondly, what is your personal perspective on today's topic? I know that safety and effectiveness can mean slightly different things depending on context. So I'm curious to hear what it means for you and what it brings up for you. So let's start with you, Jigasa. What do you think?
Sure. Hi, everyone. My name is Jigasa Grover. I'm a machine learning engineer by profession and working at Twitter. I'm also like a machine learning Google developer expert, and recently co-authored the book called Sculpting Data for Machine Learning. Though open source might not be something that I work directly with, I have had a lot of experience in the past, and we do apply open source frameworks like TensorFlow currently at Twitter. So I have like a very unusual story of jumping onto the open source bandwagon. I started contributing to open source not because I had planned to, but because a project named Pharaoh fascinated to the then 18-year-old me. I randomly came across maybe like a call for papers or like a call for contributors or something like this, or just some article, I believe, on my Twitter feed. And the name Pharaoh stuck to me. It sounded closer to an Egyptian mummy more than like a project or like a programming environment. But when I dove like deeper into it, like got to know it's kind of like an IDE and OS rolled into one based on the language Smalltalk, which is one of the first object-oriented programming languages. So I would say I was enticed more by its name, and it kept me hooked with its simplicity and the immediate feedback, especially from the community, and opened up a ton of opportunities for me, like beyond Smalltalk in Android, Java, machine learning, especially in the open source community. So I would say I'm forever grateful to Pharaoh for introducing me to this wonderful world of open source. And that was my story of a project that means a lot to me. Regarding open source, definitely it saves like a lot of time and cost and allows organization to say essentially outsource maintenance, if I would like put it in very simple terms. But we can say that open source gets like a lot of eyes. But theoretically, a lot of eyes would mean like it is very, the bugs are spotted and fixed easily. But I guess the major drawback in using open source safely and effectively would be everyone, like not everyone, I would say majority of the people working on open source are volunteers, and it totally depends on their time and how effective they are in basically spotting those vulnerabilities and solving them. And the free accessibility to the code, even though it's advantageous, it also gives hackers to exploit that code and cause potential harms. So I would say the key thing that comes with open source is its own can of worms and vulnerabilities. So that is something that should be kept in mind, while using open source software and adopting it to your team.
Awesome, thank you. Yeah, that makes a lot of sense, and it brings up quite a few topics that we'll cover in a moment in a lot more depth. What about you, Shalon?
Excuse me. Yes, hi. I am Dr. Shallon Brown. I was the first person in the world at the time to publish a manuscript on Drupal. There had never been one published successfully at the time that I did it. This was about 4 or 5 years ago now, from Capella University. I own my own software company. We are a Drupal specialized shop, but we're also starting to get into a plethora of other things, in the realization that, well, open source will always be here. Drupal will always be here. It's now more about, in the more layman's terms, can I build you a car? It isn't about whether it's the Honda or the Hyatt, or the Hyundai or the Fiat. It's just people just want a nice car for a decent price. And so you're still pivoting between these two fundamental models of, okay, there is you typically, and even the what I'd call the proprietary shops now even have their own sort of, as you guys know, open sourced model, or models that are or semi open source, to try to cut into this market, because they've started to catch on to the fact that excuse me, a lot of places out there are going to be in a sphere where they don't want to be stuck with huge licensing fees, and that are millions of dollars a year. And on top of that, they want the ability for someone to say, okay, I can pay the money, but give me a team of engineers and I can build you whatever I want. There is no canned chunk it of anything. It's really the sky's the limit in general. And I think that speaks very highly to the open source community. Now, in the case of Drupal specifically, talking about open source platforming, as if we're talking about the safety and security, it is the most secure CMS, that open source CMS on the planet, mostly because it does have a dedicated security team that regularly patches and applies. However, of course, that is not to say that it's impervious like any other software. There are, all software has bugs, as you guys know. That is software 101, engineering 101. There is no such thing, no matter what you're doing, or an engineering product, whether it's hardware or software, will have bugs. That is the inevitable of life. But having a regular security patch team, I started doing it back about 17 years ago now, about 2007, roughly, back when, right before the great economic kind of Great Recession, as we would now call it, was happening, and particularly nonprofit, which is what I was working for at the time, really wanted to get rid of that licensing fee, of millions of dollars, and really sort of segregate itself off of, or at least wean itself off of, the proprietary model, to save that money, because we already had engineers on staff and always would to maintain the system. What if we just train them up a little bit more and get them fitted for open source? Then we really kind of cut out the middleman, so to speak. So that is a lot of it. But doing it safely has become an evolution, because now that it's cool to do it and everyone is doing it, and there's a lot of different ways to do it. And not only that, it's fusing with other things. Now it's not so completely segregated. Now it's actually more common to have a shop that has a little bit of everything going on in it, especially if you work for a bigger shop. It is more common now to have a little bit of WordPress and a little bit of Drupal, a little bit of Laravel, and a little bit of Microsoft, and a little bit of AWS. You've got all kinds of things going on at once. So how do you make them all fall in love together, is the broader question, securely, especially because that becomes a much more complex question now. This is not just about the CMS layer itself. You are talking about everything from the firewall down, and even outside of that. You're talking about the server level. You're talking about, is it cloud centralized or not? You're talking about the Git repo. You're talking about all of these things combined. So for me, the conversation has to be wrapped around that context of, what do we do to harness all of these pieces that it may be talking to, and really making layers of security around it.
Absolutely, yeah. It's such a holistic conversation that we'll again dig into it in a little bit more. But it's so interesting, because I feel like engineers a lot of the time will look for the like root cause of things, and in conversations like security, it's never really like, if only it only ever was a root cause for something. A lot of the time, it's about those layers and how they play together with each other. Um, Joe, how about you?
Hi, everybody. I'm Giuseppe. I am an open source engineer at IBM, primarily working in the Node.js space, and over the last couple of years have been very involved in the OpenJS Foundation, and recently was promoted to manage a team of cloud engineers, open source engineers focused on like Kubernetes and the cloud environment. And I concur with Dr. Brown. I think that I oftentimes am promoting open source, whether it's individuals or companies. I feel like if we're all building on the same platform, let's all work on it together and, essentially like crowdsource all of this development work. And I think that, if you are depending on these open source tools, then you should absolutely be involved in the development of them, whether you're looking for feature development or performance or whatnot. The best thing to do is to actually be involved in the development of these platforms. But it's even more so with security, right? I mean, oftentimes security issues are reported privately and dealt with them, before they're public. And if you are depending on this tooling, wouldn't you like to be at the table knowing about these security issues and helping to fix them in a timely manner, not only for yourself but for the community at large? So, I agree with what everyone said already, that getting involved in open source has a variety of benefits, but I think security is particularly important these days for sure.
Absolutely, yeah. And last but not least, Chetan. Hi.
Hi, everybody. My name is Chetan Konaki, CTO and founder at Shift Left. And this is a very pressing topic to discuss. And, as far as my background is concerned, I spent over 2 decades building financial engines, transaction engines for both investment banking and retail banking. So in this space, I cut my teeth both trying to regulate software to ensure that what we build is secure, and also adopted many open source ecosystems, frameworks, libraries as I built software. Often as a consumer, you want things that work all the time, and you assume those that are producing on the other side are being paid to produce. So the important aspect is open source developers are actually building software with an intrinsic motivation that is not associated with incentives. Just like how a business would pay a salary and a payroll, open source engineers are not paid. So at that junction, I realized for me to build that empathy, I should start possibly contributing. So I began to cut my teeth from that aspect, build some libraries in the Hadoop ecosystem, when it was nascent at that point. And what I came back with is a degree of humility, because, open source never sleeps. And the other aspect is you cannot manage open source, just like how a business manages their employees and their distribution supply chains. Open source is decentralized, and everyone's a volunteer running with the gas of motivation, right? And their motivation is not mapped to incentives. This discussion is somewhat critical at this point, given that we're all witnessing what's playing out with Log4j, right? On one side, we have vendors who are shaming open source contributors. On the other side, you have companies who are pushing and pressuring these contributors to push patches, assuming that patches can solve everything from a security standpoint. So great panel. I'd love to continue the discussion and see where we land in terms of how to use it securely. But thank you.
Yeah, absolutely. So yes, as all of our panelists have said, using open source software in the context of companies and in context of an enterprise is becoming more and more common practice, especially recently. I was reading up a little bit on just the history of open source, just preparing for our conversation, and I realized like it started maybe as a bit of rebellion maybe back in the day against like big corp software, but there's more and more a coexistence and an overlap, if you want, of the two worlds. And it's not only in just a software in itself, but even the different models, like the decentralization model that you just talked about, Chetan, is more and more present as well. So it's not just the open source software itself, but it's also as a way to build software as a governance and business models is something that we see more and more commonly. It of course comes with many benefits. You already spoke some of them, bringing together folks that don't necessarily work within the same company and making sure that we sort of build really a distributed team across all of the world without all of the limitations that any one company would be facing in terms of finding talent and expertise. All of that brings into the game a lot of superpowers in a way that we'll get to in a moment. It also brings some trade-offs to consider, and there are some risks or perception of risks sometimes that get associated with the adoption and use of open source. Some of them are around security, vulnerability. Some of them are around the effectiveness aspect of it. So how do we build alignment when we don't have this one organization that, as you said, Chetan, signs everybody's checks and builds alignment perhaps that way, or has a unique product strategy to offer and for everybody to refer back to. So it's quite interesting conversations of how that might happen in an open source context. So Chetan, I wanted to start with you, and I would love to learn a little bit more about what you have seen as maybe some potential pitfalls. So if you had to speak to maybe a couple of patterns of vulnerabilities or sort of security considerations that teams open themselves up to when deciding to adopt open source software as part of their strategy or as part of their code base, what would that be? So what would be a couple of pointers that you would offer?
Absolutely. First of all, I'd like to start with the notion of judgment, right? If something fundamentally goes wrong, it's natural to figure out who to blame and pick apart. And we got to stop doing that, period, right? We got to figure out how to triage, how to postmortem and understand improving the posture rather than getting into this blame game. And with Log4j, we're sort of seeing that play out in a very negative way. I'd like to draw one particular very subtle point that Dr. Shallon had specified, which is she used the automotive industry, and supply chain in course of a narrative. But if we examine the supply chain and distribution management of an automotive industry, car manufacturing, right? There is a supply chain where the major components of the supply chain include OEMs, distribution centers, and each of these entities are building your steering wheel, your seats, your seat belt, etc. And as the manufacturer puts all of these sub-assemblies together, the most important aspect that hinges the proper functioning of each one of this is a specification. Meaning that, if you manufacture a seat belt, you define the specification, and that specification entails how you utilize that seat belt when you merge that little part into the whole, which is the car, right? And if a consumer faces an accident, now you're not going to go after and blame that this happened because of the seat belt. It boils down to how effectively the car is taking that sub-assembly, which is the seat belt, and putting it together in the whole, which is the car, right? Synonymous with drawing the point from this supply chain analogy, the library is built with a generic notion. If you take, for example, a collections library, right? The common focus is to store a certain type, to store many types, and then provide the ability to retrieve with an index and so on and so forth. Now, there are many ways to use it the right way and abuse it too. So it becomes a joint responsibility of the producer and the consumer. The producer of the open source library, the author, should create documentation which explains how to use it, and also create a specification saying, if you use it in this context, these are the things that you should enable and disable. And now from a consumer perspective, when you begin to use it, you have to understand how you are using it and what is your exposure from an attack surface perspective. Because the asymmetry here is that if you have not taken care of your attack surface and exposed a library which anyone can go out and read the source code of, an adversarial entity now understands a significant portion of your application construct. And now all they have to do is figure out a way to touch it, right? And that's what we're seeing over play in and play out, where open source is being exploited, not because the library is weak, it's because the consumers are not using it in an effective way that is leading to this exposure.
That's so interesting, and yeah, it goes back to the point of it's never one thing in isolation. It's kind of how is it used in a bigger context, in the context of a supply chain of software. I know that we have folks from all different backgrounds in the audience today, and there's folks that are, developers, folks in leadership roles, pardon me, open source contributors, full time. Jigasa, I was curious if you had any thoughts for the developers and team leads among the audience. What is some advice or some pointers that you could offer when it comes to decisions that they have to make on either evaluating and experimenting with a piece of software or making the decision to adopt it as part of the solution that they're going forward with for a problem?
Sure. So I believe that communication is the key. And the first and foremost thing would be to start a discussion with the key stakeholders, especially in the requirement elicitation stage, to figure out like why and how are we planning to use it. One important thing while adopting an external open source software would be, what is your long-term plan? Because as I also mentioned, and other folks also mentioned, that open source work is mostly volunteer work. There are no incentives involved. So what is our backup plan when the volunteer team or like they stop maintaining it? Like, would we be able to take it forward on our own terms in the future? How would it impact our business, especially if revenue is involved? So that is one key thing that should be focused on. So to mitigate that, one major thing that we also do it would be to get involved in the community of the developers that actually work on that particular piece of open source software. For example, TensorFlow, even though it is an open source and there are like paid developers as well as volunteer developers, we use like TensorFlow for our machine learning models. So one example would be whenever we feel like a security issue or like a normal bug, even we try to not only solve it on our end, but also like give back to the community. So that is one important thing that could be taken care of, especially if you as a big corporation or a big team is using or adopting open source software. And another aspect that can be taken care is the legality aspect. So make sure that the licenses and all are taken care of before you jump into running a pilot. And running a pilot is again an important step before the adoption. Another thing that I would like to highlight would be having a discussion with the commercial vendors if possible, because they have the adequate product knowledge and they might have worked on the same piece of open source software with other folks from, like, say, different companies or different startups. And you can learn from their basically experiences on what went wrong or what were the pitfalls and how they mitigated that. And one thing, again, to be noted is not all developers are security experts. So it is very, very important to get it audited, especially if it is something that, uses data to ensure that there are no leaks happening. And because, data privacy is a big thing, especially if you're using machine learning, open source software, because I can speak from my perspective of machine learning. So those would be my tips for, developers and team leads before they start using or even start running a pilot for open source software.
I'll add too, Maria, if you don't mind, to continue with what Jigyasa is saying. Do your homework before you really kind of go all in on one of these open source projects. So as Jigyasa was saying about licensing and such, also see what their security reporting policies are. See if they take it seriously. What's in place? Do they have a bug bounty program? How do they handle reports and such? You can look at Node.js, which is the community I primarily work in, as an example. We have a bunch of documentation there and a bug bounty program, and we work with HackerOne. So see how seriously that's taken. And then also, I think we've all been kind of touching on this a bit, but what is the governance model of the open source project? I primarily work in open source foundations, the OpenJS Foundation and a variety of Linux Foundation organizations, and we strive for this open governance. We strive for a level playing field amongst the companies that are involved. There are typically limits on how many members from one company can be on the technical steering committee and things like that. So if you end up in a position where you have some sort of security vulnerability in a project you're relying on, and it's maintained by a BDFL, what is it, benevolent dictator for life, or whatever that maps out to, you might have more trouble getting that security work managed. But if you are working with a project that's in a foundation and has all of this governance model in place, hopefully you're already engaged in that project. But if you're not, you will probably have a better chance of trying to influence the direction and having things tended to in a more timely manner.
Yeah, absolutely. And it goes back to the previous point of, part of it is, and the way bigger part is not how much is the library, weak, is the library exploited in itself. It's way more so as a user, have I done my homework? Do I know what I'm being exposed to? And it's way more than the software. It's also how is software being developed, and how can I make sure that I'm comfortable with the amount of risk that I'm taking on? Dr. Shalon, I was wondering I was wondering if the same question from a slightly different perspective, almost from the other side of an organization. So if we were to speak to senior leaders that might be looking to create, if you want, broader policies or strategies for the organization, or even share frameworks and vocabularies with their team, how would you recommend they start that conversation? So when they're trying to almost build a culture and start building a way of thinking of adopting open source within a company, what is some advice that you would offer to these folks?
Sure. So my company is Stackmaster, and it's something that we get all the time, particularly for new potential clients, but also existing ones. The first thing I would say is that, first of all, you need a specialist at this. I've watched it go wrong on multiple occasions, I think, in a really big, bad way. And often it's because there is this notion of, in Joe's case, for example, we've got people that know JavaScript, so I must be able to make them easily do Node.js, or I have people that do PHP, so they must be able to be good at Drupal and all these other things. And it's, as you all know, way, way more complicated than that. You need, at least for consulting level, it can be fundamentally okay to have that be the case for the underbelly of your development team, but you have got to get an architect level someone to help lead this conversation. You cannot just walk into this blindly and expect for it to turn out rosy most 99% of the time. I'm sure there are exceptions. So that's first and foremost. Second of all, when we're talking about the security layer of this or the safety of this, the other fundamental element, I would say, from a team perspective and getting that conversation started, excuse me, is going to be, we have to think of software, as you all probably know, as a sort of moving, evolving thing. It isn't like we did the project is done. It's going to be something like, we thought of the project, we started to develop the project, we did discovery first, or UI, UX, whatever you want to call it. And then we developed it. And now we're in maintenance mode, and we kind of rinse and repeat, and we keep doing that and expanding off of it. So in thinking of it within that context, we have to then start thinking about what's endgame look like in the longer term plan as it relates to mapping this to the organizational goals over time. What is the end goal? Is it that we want to be more competitive as far as our major pain points go with our existing software? Is it that there is a hole in the existing framework of what we have that we're trying to fill? Is it that we as an organization want to get away from licenses? Is it, and the money, is it monetary? What are the major issues? Is it because we used another open source framework and it went haywire? Why are you at this table? What are you coming to this table to achieve? So flushing out the pain points is one of the bigger contexts I found of how to get that conversation started, and then ultimately map make a roadmap from there as to where you want to end up at a high level. It doesn't have to be, excuse me, even as specific as one specific open source product. But if the decision is being made that, yes, we want to start looking at open source and get that ball rolling, let's look at what is currently driving us all crazy, or what is it we want to change about our existing model, and then start to work with either consultants, vendors, whatever, even internally, if you want to call it that as well, as to how to fill those gaps. And is it something more simplistic as far as we use open source to sort of fill these gaps, especially if we're talking about from a UI UX perspective, and some of the JavaScript frameworks, or are we going balls to the wall? Are we really just ripping the sucker apart, and all that comes with it, and really approaching this from a more holistic perspective of we're going to replace our entire infrastructure? And sometimes, as you all know, that includes the hardware that comes with it. Maybe, okay, the servers, Microsoft, all that stuff has to go. Maybe we're going to completely refurbish what we have and transform it. The third and final thing I would say is the training, is that you have got to get a lot of people in your organization sold on this concept. It is not going to be usually as easy as me and my boss talk, excuse me, and we're ready to go. You have got to think about concepts like there are always going to be in any organization, even in tech, what we call the dinosaur effect, which is there are people that are very comfortable with what they had. It doesn't matter how efficient or inefficient it was. And it doesn't matter what was proprietary or not. And it doesn't matter that there are better things out there. They liked what they liked. Some people are, people are always afraid of the next big thing, the new thing, whatever it is, because it's new. So you have got to sell this, so to speak, in a way that is going to be adaptable to from everyone from the CEO level that can easily sort of proctor a narrative around why you're doing this from the pain points up, all the way down to Joe Smith or John Doe or whatever that is sitting at his cubicle, typing away and trying to maintain this system. And that is just, I think, for any organization, so critical. Otherwise, you're going to lead to, even though the system is good, we all know that's a very ambiguous term. You have to sell it. You have to make it people be able to say, oh, look, it's faster, it's prettier, it's more accessibility, it's more compliant, it's more responsive. Look at that. We don't need a mobile app to solve these issues. You've got to wrap that narrative around all of these things with the safety and security layer of it. It's safer because why? And make it simple. You can't get into, well, the firewall layer and this, it's going to go over everybody's head. You have to say, well, it's safer because look at this. I can enter in my username and password, it's encrypted, and that just simply means that at a higher level, so it's way easier, it's way less easy to hack. Or hey, look at this, now we're on we're on an environment where there's forms that you can submit that aren't so easy to just take people's data. Hey, look, it's a lot harder to bring it down. Hey, look, there's a regular patch cycle, sell it. You've got to really be able to sell it in a way that's going to be coherent to people who aren't necessarily in the ether of our space.
Absolutely. This it's such an interesting point that you're making. It reminds me something from maybe product management worlds. I might be mistaken in that, but it reminds me of that curve of like early adopters, late adopters, bulk adopters. And I wonder if it's a similar conversation here in a way. Like there will be naturally people in any group really that will be like really interested to try out the new cool thing, and folks that might have more hesitations. But I feel like as a senior leader, as you said, your job is to make sure that you're empowering these folks to like know how to use the tool that you're kind of betting on, but also empowering them to ask the right questions, making sure that they can truly integrate and work with this for the long term. A question. Oh, sorry.
There was
go ahead.
Sorry, there was one thought that crossed my mind again, based on as a follow-up point, right? If you divide these groups into 4 clusters, you essentially have 4 groups at play. One of the groups is the open source ecosystem in the community. The other is the organization that is consuming the open source, comprising of engineers, managers, CISOs. The third group is vendors who are essentially pitching their product, saying, our product is, the magic wand that will solve all your problems. And often vendors are intrinsically motivated to inject FUD or fear, uncertainty, and doubt, saying the world is collapsing, we are here to save you. And then you have the adversarial entities, like nation state actors or hackers who also have improved their posture. They're no longer just script kiddies sitting down trying to hit your endpoints. So very quickly, I'll deconstruct these four groups, right? Because there's some economic play between all these four groups. The first group is the open source community. Initially, they were motivated, decentralized, focused on building value. And their motivation trigger was not incentives. They were just doing it because they enjoyed doing it. Now they have to begin to worry about how these nation state actors can employ social engineering to enter their ecosystem and cause collateral damage. We're seeing that play out over and over again with the situation where a committer enters into the ecosystem, but their intent is not to commit, but to actually exploit, to place a backdoor, to place a patch, figure a way to get in and then crypto mine because they understand the supply chain. We saw that play out with UA parser.js and the Node.js. I mean, Joe can be a testament to that. Now that's forcing the open source committers to be more vigilant because they have no choice, right? It's the situation as such. With that being said, they have to look at these attributes like bus factor. They often call it blast radius and bus factor, which is the frequency and velocity at which someone enters the ecosystem. What is their reputation? How much are they committing? And what is their instruments to measure the intent of what they're committing? Unfortunately, that's going to become a reality in the coming days. Now, moving or shifting to vendors, it is important for vendors to really focus on providing value, not messaging to stand apart from the other vendor. Unfortunately, the reality is everyone wants to get the dollar of the budget, and they're going to say many things that don't matter and are not real. So anyone buying a product should essentially vet the product to see if it's efficient enough and the degree of efficacy is high enough that it's solving that problem in a targeted way. Finally, moving to the APTs or these threat actors, right? With SolarWinds, when they deconstructed UNC or APT 29, the group that was responsible for this backdoor, they realized that this group is not a bunch of folks who collaborated to hack SolarWinds, but they actually had an organizational structure. They had compiler experts, they had QA people, they had language engineers, they had a leader who was essentially moderating this group. So this goes to show that the attackers are becoming sophisticated. And if the other groups or the clusters don't figure out a way to benefit, understand, and up their end game, there is going to be this strategic asymmetry, and this will lead to more problems.
Absolutely, yeah. It's quite interesting to look at this from this perspective of like there's many different, almost as you said, like roles and different contributions to the ecosystem from those different perspectives. I feel that there is perhaps one of these four areas, if you want, roles that we haven't quite covered yet, and that is the role of the open source contributor in that ecosystem. And Joe, I would love to hear your thoughts on that. What, from the perspective of a sort of a maintainer or contributor of an open source project, what are some things that you'd recommend folks keep in mind to ensure that the software and the community that they support and they're part of is covered from that perspective, so that they inspire confidence in their users from a security perspective, that they're able to work effectively and be productive and get things done, but also do it in a way that is sustainable and build systems around it so that it's something that they can continue to keep up with as the community grows.
Yeah, I would go back to some of the earlier points as well. I think having a security reporting program is really important. I think, like Chetan was saying earlier, having documentation on how to use it safely, what attack vectors may be available, or surface areas. Being mindful of the security constraints of your platform, which is something that we debate often in Node.js. And I'm thinking particularly about some differences between Node.js and Dino, which is another kind of Node.js competitor, for lack of a better term, really. Yeah, I mean, those are the things that I would go back to. And I think, being a part of a foundation is also a good place to be, because there are a lot of resources in place, whether it's infrastructure for testing or potentially resources for security mitigation, or even just simply guidance and policies and procedures that may be something that the foundation is experienced with. So that's always a benefit. Yeah, those are some initial thoughts that I have. I'll also add too, one of the things that we're doing at the OpenJS Foundation, and it's a little bit related to a question that I answered in the chat there, is with the way Node.js is structured, we rely a lot on these small packages and NPM, and that dependency tree can really get to be quite large. There's a joke on the internet about the ball in space, and that's your NPM packages warping time and space. So that can be a little bit overwhelming. There are some techniques like NPM audit to kind of see what vulnerabilities may have been reported up through your package chain and allow you to work on updating your dependencies so that any vulnerabilities may be addressed. But the truth is that some of those vulnerabilities that are reported through that tool or through your GitHub pull requests or your GitHub repo can be false positives. And so one of the things we're doing in the OpenJS Foundation is we've started, we have these concepts of collaboration spaces where anyone can get involved with others on a particular topic. And one of them that we're working on right now is package vulnerabilities in the Node.js space to be able to manage the alerts better, the communications better. A lot of open source maintainers are getting these dependabot alerts that aren't something that they can address, and so it's a complicated space that we're trying to work in. But if you're interested in helping work on this sort of stuff, you can go there and get involved, or reach out to me directly. My Twitter DMs are open. So yeah, I mean, I think in open source, it really is sort of a community effort. So if you have any interest in this, I encourage you to get involved in the space that you're interested in.
Absolutely, yeah. Cool. Thank you so much, everybody. It's a bit hard to believe, but the 45 minutes have gone past quite quickly. So as we're coming towards the end of our conversation today, I wanted to just take a couple minutes and summarize a few main takeaway points that we talked about today. I think the one thing to definitely remember is that a lot of what comes into safety and effectiveness is contextual, and it's about layers, and it's about the holistic conversation of how is this piece of software used, how is it developed in the community, but also how are we as users taking it on, what is our responsibility, more tangibly into that. And if you're sort of on the user end of this equation, it's definitely a worthy investment to take some time and understand a bit more what is the exposure, what is the risk that you're taking on, not only from the software itself in isolation, but in terms of the way that it's used and the way that it's developed and the community that supports it. And by all means, take initiative and contribute back to it and be part of evolving that community too. Oh, sorry. Yes.
It seemed like you were wrapping up, and I had a closing comment that I wanted to add, if you don't mind. I would encourage folks to, I mean, this whole conversation is especially important with the U.S. federal government recent directive that's come out of the security agency from the federal government around vulnerability reporting and mitigation. If you are unaware, you should maybe Google that. I think it came out in early November. I don't think anything's, and it's primarily for federal agencies, but I think if you are doing any work with the federal agency, this is of a big concern, which IBM, of course, is working on that proactively. So I would recommend folks look for that directive and read more about it. And then, another thing to raise is the Open Software Security Foundation, another Linux Foundation project that I encourage folks to check out. It's a foundation that's spinning up that's really focused on software security, supply chain security. It's early stages, so if you have an interest in this work, I encourage you to look at that and get involved. And there's an initiative that's sort of alongside OpenSSF called sos.dev is the URL. And that's some money being set aside to address security issues. So if you are focused on security, you could submit the work that you're doing there and potentially get a reward from the pool of money that has been donated there. It's something that we in open source are focused on and trying to get some resources and such for the Node.js space. But if you're, whether you're working in a project or doing security work, that's something to check out as well.
Awesome. Thank you so much. Yeah, some very, very tangible next steps and opportunities for folks who might be interested to contribute directly to that cause. Cool. And so the second thing that stood out to me and wanted to make sure that folks take away with them is that just like with many other decisions and conversations that happen within organizations of any kind, be it open source or companies themselves, it's always a good idea to tie it to the bigger why and to the bigger end goal that you're looking to get to with that decision. It could be adoption of a specific piece of open source software in that example, but it still ties back to what is it that we're trying to achieve by going down that path. It helps with starting that conversation and helps with continuing to have it as your company strategy might evolve, or as teams might be naturally be learning more about that space and asking more and more sophisticated questions. Awesome. So thank you again very much. Thank you to our panelists. Thank you to our attendees for sticking around and listening to the conversation. We'll all be heading to the Lead Dev Slack now in the technical strategy channel. So please come on over there and we'll continue the conversation. Thank you so much for joining us again, and we hope to see you next time. Bye.